They tell you the United States was an isolationist power. They tell you that while Europe feasted on the African continent, America sat on the sidelines because it was too weak, too distracted, or too noble to join the carving knife. This is a lie. The United States did not miss the scramble for Africa. It rejected it. Washington looked at the map, saw the strategic trap that Britain, France, and Germany were walking into, and decided that the future of global dominance didn't look like a colony. It looked like a market. While the old world obsessed over planting flags in the sand, the rising American hegemon was already designing a new kind of empire, one that required no garrisons, no governors, and no borders. They didn't want the land. They wanted the ledger. You're watching Power Explained, dissecting the architecture of dominance. If you value this depth of analysis, subscribing ensures you don't miss the next investigation. To understand this calculated refusal, we have to step into the smoke-filled drawing rooms of the Berlin Conference in 1884. This was the moment the mask slipped. 14 nations gathered at the invitation of Otto von Bismarck, not to prevent war, but to formalize theft. On the wall of the Chancellor's palace hung a massive map of Africa, largely blank, waiting to be filled with the colors of European flags. The atmosphere was one of frenzied acquisition. King Leopold of Belgium was maneuvering for the Congo. France was eyeing the West. Britain sought a continuous line of control from Cairo to Cape Town. It was the greatest land grab in human history, a geopolitical gold rush where prestige was measured in square miles of jungle and desert. And sitting quietly at that table was the United States. Represented by John A. Casson, the American delegation was present, but their behavior was perplexing to the European powers. Casson was an expansionist. He believed in American power. Yet, as the European delegates haggled over river basins and trade routes, carving up populations they had never met, the United States made no claim. They requested no protectorates. They drew no lines for themselves. To the French and British, this looked like hesitation. In reality, it was a precise assessment of return on investment. The European model of empire was heavy. It was built on the Roman style: conquer, occupy, administer. This required massive standing armies, expensive bureaucracies, and the constant suppression of local resistance. It was a model of high overhead. When Britain claimed a territory, it became responsible for it. It had to build the railroads, staff the police stations, and fight the border wars. The prestige was high, but the profit margins were often razor-thin, eaten away by the cost of maintenance. The United States, watching from across the Atlantic, saw a failing business model. By the 1880s, America was undergoing its own violent transformation. The Civil War had forged a centralized industrial titan. The factories of the North were producing steel and textiles at rates that terrified British economists. But the American approach to land was fundamentally different because America already had its own empire to conquer. It just happened to be contiguous. The American West was the primary focus of Washington's territorial hunger. The wars against the Native American nations, the expansion of the railroads, and the integration of the Pacific Coast were consuming the nation's military and logistical bandwidth. Washington understood a concept that Europe was ignoring: strategic overextension. To scramble for Africa would require a blue water navy that the U.S. did not yet possess and would split its focus from the consolidation of the North American continent. But this was not just about logistics. It was about the evolution of control. American strategists were beginning to formulate a theory of power that rendered traditional colonies obsolete. Why own the land when you can own the economy? Why pay for the government when you can just buy the politician? The Europeans were playing a game of flags. The Americans were preparing to play a game of dollars. This was the embryonic stage of dollar diplomacy and the open-door policy. The goal was not to exclude other powers from a territory, but to force every territory open to American goods. If the U.S. had taken a slice of Africa, it would have been locked into a closed mercantilist system. It would have been forced to defend borders against the French or the Germans in a theater of war thousands of miles from home. By rejecting the scramble, the U.S. maintained the ultimate geopolitical asset: flexibility. They could trade with British colonies, sell weapons to French outposts, and extract resources without paying for the infrastructure to move them. However, there is a darker, more complex layer to this rejection. It wasn't just that America didn't want African colonies. It was that America had a terrified, neurotic relationship with the very concept of African governance. We must look at Liberia. Liberia is the anomaly that exposes the American psyche of the era. Technically, it was an American colony in all but name, founded by the American Colonization Society as a place to send freeborn Black Americans. By the time of the Scramble, Liberia was an independent republic, but it existed under the shadow of American protection. If the U.S. had wanted a foothold in the Scramble, Liberia was the perfect beachhead. They had the port, they had the cultural connection, and they had the tacit claim. Yet, Washington kept Liberia at arm's length. They offered vague diplomatic support but refused to formally annex the territory or use it as a launchpad for further expansion into the interior. This hesitation was rooted in the racial politics of the post-Civil War era. The American political elite were terrified of integrating non-white populations into the American political body. The idea of acquiring vast African territories, populated by millions of Africans, was politically toxic in a Washington that was actively constructing the Jim Crow system. European empires were comfortable ruling over subject peoples without giving them rights. The American Constitution, however, presented a problem. If the U.S. annexed territory, did the Constitution follow the flag? Would these new subjects become citizens? This legal and racial quagmire paralyzed any desire for territorial acquisition in Africa. It was cleaner, safer, and more profitable to remain a distant commercial partner. So, while King Leopold turned the Congo into a horrific labor camp to extract rubber, and Britain fought the Zulus and the Boers to secure gold and diamonds, the United States focused on a different kind of extraction. They focused on efficiency. They watched as the European powers began to turn their guns on each other over lines in the sand. The scramble for Africa sowed the seeds of the First World War, creating friction points between the great powers that would eventually ignite. By rejecting the scramble, America avoided these friction points. They allowed Europe to exhaust itself. The cost of empire began to bleed the European treasuries dry, while the American economy surged, unburdened by the weight of colonial administration. This was not passivity. This was the patience of a predator waiting for the rest of the pack to tire themselves out. But this rejection was not permanent. It was a holding pattern. As the 19th century closed and the 20th began, the American definition of frontier would shift again. They had filled the continent from sea to shining sea. The factories were producing more than the domestic population could consume. The pressure to expand was building again, but the lesson of Africa had been learned. When America finally did step onto the global stage as an imperial power, it wouldn't be in Africa. It would be in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and it would look very different from the European model. The refusal to scramble for Africa was the first major foreign policy decision that separated the United States from the European tradition. It was the moment America decided to be a different kind of monster. While Europe was obsessed with the map, America was obsessed with the mechanism. They realized that in the coming century, power would not be defined by how much land you held, but by how much leverage you could apply. To understand the full scope of this strategy, we have to look at what happened immediately after the Berlin Conference concluded. The ink was barely dry on the treaties when the reality of effective occupation set in. Europe realized that claiming land on a map was easy, holding it was a nightmare. And as the first reports of resistance and logistical failure began to drift back to London and Paris, Washington's silence began to look less like isolation and more like prophecy. You have been fed a lie about American isolationism. The standard history books will tell you the United States ignored Africa because it was too weak, too young, or too distracted to compete with the British or French empires. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of power. The United States didn't lose the race for Africa. It looked at the starting line, saw a trap, and refused to run. While Europe was busy painting the African map in varying shades of imperial red and blue, Washington was executing a far more ruthless calculation. They understood something that Bismarck and King Leopold ignored. The highest form of dominance isn't owning the land. It's owning the market without paying for the administration. This wasn't passivity. It was active rejection. To understand why America turned its back on the scramble, you have to look at the ledger. In 1885, a colony was a liability masked as an asset. To hold territory in the Congo or the Niger Delta required garrisons, supply lines, coaling stations, and a bureaucracy capable of suppressing millions of people who did not want you there. It was a massive drain on national treasure. The French taxpayer was bleeding francs to maintain prestige in West Africa. The British were stretching their naval dominance to the breaking point. The United States looked at this balance sheet and saw a bad investment. The American elite, the industrialists, and the strategists in the State Department were already engaged in their own version of the scramble, but theirs was contiguous. They were conquering the American West. This is the crucial context often omitted from the geopolitical analysis. The United States didn't need to cross an ocean to find resources, land, or indigenous populations to displace. They had the Trans-Mississippi West. The Indian Wars were the American equivalent of the Zulu Wars, but with one massive strategic advantage. Once the land was taken, it could be integrated directly into the nation-state. It wasn't a colony. It was an expansion of the core. Why would a nation obsessed with manifest destiny distract itself with a slice of the Sahara when it was still digesting California, Texas, and the Dakotas? The resource density of North America provided everything the industrial engine required: coal, iron, oil, timber, and gold. The logic of European imperialism was driven by scarcity. They lacked raw materials at home. The logic of American anti-imperialism in Africa was driven by abundance. They had everything they needed within their own borders. Furthermore, the United States was already operating under a grand strategy that strictly prohibited this kind of entanglement: the Monroe Doctrine. This wasn't just a diplomatic soundbite. It was the operating system of American foreign policy. The deal was simple but absolute. The Western Hemisphere was the American sphere of influence, and the Eastern Hemisphere was Europe's problem. If the United States had planted a flag in Angola or Kenya, it would have shattered the moral and strategic high ground of the Monroe Doctrine. You cannot demand that Europe stay out of Latin America while you are carving up their backyard in Africa. Washington traded the potential of African colonies for the certainty of Latin American hegemony. It was a masterstroke of restraint. By refusing to scramble for Africa, the United States solidified its claim over the Caribbean and South America. They chose a sphere of influence that they could patrol with a brownwater navy, rather than extending themselves into a global conflict they weren't yet built to sustain. If you are beginning to see how the refusal to act is often a more powerful strategic move than action itself, finding the like button helps support this kind of deep dive analysis into geopolitical strategy. This restraint was tested, specifically during the Berlin Conference. The United States was there. They sent a representative, John Casson. He sat at the table with the great powers. He listened to the speeches about civilization and commerce. He even signed the General Act of Berlin in a provisional capacity. But when that document returned to Washington, something extraordinary happened. President Grover Cleveland, a man who viewed foreign entanglements with deep suspicion, looked at the treaty and effectively threw it in the trash. He refused to submit it to the Senate for ratification. Cleveland's rejection was the pivot point. He argued that signing the Berlin Act would make the United States a party to the maintenance of European borders in Africa. It would obligate American blood and treasure to uphold treaties between rival kings and emperors. He famously stated that he would not commit the United States to an alliance that enforced European colonial claims. This was the moment America officially opted out. It was a declaration that the U.S. would not be a guarantor of the European order. Instead, the United States championed a different concept: the open door. This was the precursor to modern globalization. The American strategy was to demand equal trade access without political ownership. They wanted the right to sell American cotton and steel in French Senegal or British Sudan without having to pay for the soldiers policing those regions. They wanted the profit without the overhead. It was a parasitic, brilliant approach to geopolitics. Let the British build the railroads. American goods would ride on them. Let the French build the ports. American ships would dock in them. This approach was visible in the singular exception to the rule: Liberia. Critics will point to Liberia and say, "Look, America did have a colony. But Liberia proves the rule rather than breaking it. The American relationship with Liberia was ambivalent, distant, and reluctant. It was founded not by the state for resource extraction, but by the American Colonization Society for a specific social project, the repatriation of freeborn African Americans. The U.S. government refused to claim formal sovereignty over Liberia for decades. When European powers began encroaching on Liberian territory, Washington offered vague diplomatic protests but never sent a fleet. They refused to establish a formal protectorate. Even where they had a foothold, they refused to tighten their grip. They simply did not want the responsibility. The geopolitical maturity required to say no cannot be overstated. In the late 19th century, national greatness was measured in square miles of overseas territory. It was a status symbol. To be a great power meant having colonies. The pressure on Washington to join the club was immense. There were naval lobbyists, missionaries, and adventurers urging the government to grab a piece of the pie before it was all gone. But the leadership held the line. They recognized that the European powers were acquiring assets that would eventually become liabilities. They foresaw the inevitable friction. By the 1890s, the scramble was already causing diplomatic crises between the European powers, the Fashoda incident, the tensions over Morocco. These were flashpoints that threatened to drag the continent into war. Because the United States had no stake in the partition, it had no dog in the fight. It remained neutral, uncompromised, and flexible. While Britain and France were locking themselves into rigid defensive postures to protect their African claims, the United States was free to focus on its industrial explosion. This period of rejection allowed the U.S. economy to surpass the British Empire. While London was obsessed with the Cape to Cairo Railway, Pittsburgh was outproducing the entire British steel industry. The opportunity cost of imperialism was high, and America refused to pay it. They invested in factories, not forts. They built infrastructure at home, not in the tropics. But there is a darker, more cynical layer to this rejection. It wasn't just about economics or the Monroe Doctrine. It was about a fundamental belief in the racial hierarchy of the time, viewed through a lens of extreme pragmatism. The American political class looked at the demographics of Africa and saw a governance nightmare. Having just fought a civil war over the issue of slavery and struggling with the failure of Reconstruction, the last thing Washington wanted was to incorporate millions of non-white subjects into the American political system. The Constitution was not built for an empire of subjects. It was built for a republic of citizens. Acquiring African territory would have forced a constitutional crisis. Would the Congolese be citizens? Would they vote? If not, how does a republic justify ruling them? Europe solved this with the hypocrisy of the civilizing mission, claiming they were ruling for the benefit of the colonized. The United States, paralyzed by its own internal racial tensions, couldn't stomach the political complexity. It was easier to stay out. It was cleaner to be a trading partner than a colonial master. This decision shaped the 20th century. When the world wars finally erupted, wars partially fueled by colonial rivalries, the United States entered as a liberator, not a rival landlord. They didn't have to defend African colonies from German aggression because they didn't have any. This allowed them to position themselves as the anti-colonial superpower later in the century, a diplomatic lever they would use to dismantle the British and French empires they had wisely refused to join. The rejection of the scramble was the first step in the long game of replacing European dominance with American hegemony. They let Europe bankrupt itself on the cost of empire, waiting for the moment to buy the assets at a discount. Stop thinking America missed the boat on Africa. They didn't miss anything. They looked at the boat, realized it was leaking, realized the captain was drunk, and realized the ticket price was the sovereignty of their own nation. The standard narrative that the United States was simply too distracted by the Wild West or Reconstruction to grab a slice of the African continent is a lie we tell ourselves to soften the reality of raw power dynamics. It assumes that acquiring territory is always the winning move, that painting the map your color is the ultimate metric of strength. It isn't. In the game of grand strategy, the player who refuses to overextend is usually the one holding the knife when the dust settles. America didn't reject the scramble because they were weak. They rejected it because they saw it for what it truly was, a vanity project that would bleed the treasuries of Europe dry while Washington balanced its books. While London and Paris were celebrating their new acquisitions, drawing arbitrary lines across the Sahara and the Congo, Washington was running the numbers. The calculus of empire had changed, and the Europeans were too blinded by prestige to notice. Old world imperialism was built on the premise of direct control, boots on the ground, flags on the poles, and administrators in the capital. This required massive standing armies, constant suppression of local rebellions, and an endless stream of capital to build infrastructure that yielded marginal returns. The United States looked at the balance sheet of the British Raj or French West Africa and saw a liability disguised as an asset. Why pay for the road when you can just drive the truck? Why pay the police force when you can just sell them the guns? This was the dawn of a new kind of dominance, one that rendered the clumsy territorial grabs of the Scramble obsolete before the ink on the Berlin Conference treaties was even dry. The strategic restraint was fueled by the realization that the most valuable resource in the 20th century would not be land, but access. The open-door policy, articulated by Secretary of State John Hay regarding China, was the blueprint they quietly applied to the rest of the world, including Africa. The American demand was simple: we don't want to govern you, we just want to sell to you. By insisting on equal trade access without the burden of political administration, the United States forced the European powers to shoulder the costs of colonization, building the ports, dredging the rivers, pacifying the populations, while American corporations swooped in to utilize those markets without paying a cent in taxes to a colonial administration. It was a parasitic brilliance. Let the British taxpayer fund the Royal Navy to patrol the shipping lanes. American merchant vessels would sail them for free. If this analysis of strategic patience is reshaping how you view historical power dynamics, subscribing ensures you don't miss the conclusion of this geopolitical autopsy. This model of informal empire allowed the United States to maintain the moral high ground while engaging in ruthless economic extraction. They could condemn the brutality of King Leopold in the Congo, leveraging the public outcry to weaken Belgian diplomatic standing, all while American rubber companies quietly negotiated favorable contracts in the region. It was a dual-use weapon: diplomatic sanctity on the surface, commercial dominance underneath. This hypocrisy was not a bug in the system. It was the primary feature. By refusing to formally join the Scramble, the U.S. avoided the diplomatic entanglements that were dragging Europe toward the abyss of the First World War. Every colony France acquired was a friction point with Germany. Every protectorate Britain established was a potential spark for conflict with Russia. The United States had zero friction points in Africa because it had zero territory. They were effectively invisible targets, accumulating wealth in a room full of men pointing guns at each other. Furthermore, the rejection of African colonization was driven by a cold, domestic pragmatism regarding the American social fabric. The internal debates in Washington were not just about money. They were about the racial and political composition of the republic. The Anti-Imperialist League, which included titans like Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain, argued vehemently against annexation, but often for reasons that challenge our modern sensibilities. There was a pervasive fear among the American elite that incorporating millions of non-white subjects into the American legal system would destabilize the racial hierarchy they had violently established at home. They looked at the chaos of the British trying to manage the diverse populations of India and Africa and wanted no part of it. The decision to stay out of Africa was, in part, a decision to maintain a specific, controlled demographic order within the United States. It was isolationism born of prejudice as much as prudence. They wanted the resources of the global South, but they terrified of the people. This hesitation to absorb foreign populations stands in stark contrast to the European approach, which sought to assimilate or subjugate vast numbers of people under the crown. The American method was cleaner, colder, and more efficient. Instead of colonies, they sought client states. Instead of subjects, they sought customers. This is why, while Europe was scrambling for Africa, the United States was tightening its grip on Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine was the inverse of the scramble. In Africa, the goal was to grab as much as possible. In the Americas, the goal was to prevent anyone else from grabbing anything. The U.S. turned the entire Western Hemisphere into a fortress of market exclusivity. They didn't need the Congo, they had Cuba. They didn't need the Suez. They were building the Panama Canal. The construction of the Panama Canal serves as the perfect counterexample to the African scramble. While the French failed in Panama because they tried to run it like a colony, the Americans succeeded because they ran it like a military-industrial complex. They engineered the separation of Panama from Colombia not to create a colony, but to secure a strategic asset, the Canal Zone. It was a strip of land purely for transit and power projection, stripped of the messy responsibilities of nation-building. This was the American upgrade to the colonial software. Minimal land, maximum leverage. While the British were bogged down in the Boer War, spending blood and treasure to secure gold mines in South Africa, the U.S. secured the pivot point of global maritime trade in Panama with a fraction of the casualties and a fraction of the overhead. This sufficiency created a surplus of power that the United States began to hoard. By 1900, the U.S. economy had surpassed that of the British Empire, yet its defense spending was significantly lower relative to its GDP. Why? Because they didn't have to garrison a global empire. They didn't have to station troops in Timbuktu or Nairobi. That capital was reinvested into domestic industrialization, into the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of Detroit. This economic engine was being primed for the moment Europe inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own imperial ambitions. The scramble for Africa was a sugar rush for Europe, a quick hit of resources and prestige that led to a crash. The American rejection was a protein-rich diet of industrial consolidation. Critics at the time called the U.S. provincial, claiming it lacked the stomach for global leadership. They mistook digestion for starvation. The U.S. was digesting its own continent, integrating the West, and solidifying its industrial base. The leaders in Washington understood that the era of land-based empires was ending, and the era of credit-based empires was beginning. By staying out of Africa, they avoided the rigid alliances that colonization necessitated. When the Great War finally arrived, triggered in no small part by the colonial rivalries the U.S. had sidestepped, America was the only great power with a free hand. They were not bound by treaty to defend a patch of desert in North Africa or a jungle in the Congo. They were free to sell munitions to both sides until the moment was right to step in and dictate the peace. The rejection of the scramble was the ultimate hedge. It was a bet against the sustainability of the European model. And as the 20th century ground on, as the British pound lost its value and the French Republic fractured, that bet began to pay out at odds no one in Berlin or London could have imagined. The Europeans had scrambled for the past. The Americans were positioning themselves to purchase the future. They knew that eventually, the overhead of empire would become unbearable, and when the for sale signs went up on the global order, the United States would be the only buyer with cash in hand. Stop thinking this was about freedom. Stop convincing yourself that Washington looked at the map of Africa and felt a pang of moral outrage at the sight of European flags planted in the soil. That is the fairy tale version of history, the bedtime story written for the naive. The reality was cold, calculated, and mathematically ruthless. The United States didn't reject the scramble for Africa because it hated empires. It rejected the scramble because it had designed a superior one. Why would a rising hegemon want to inherit the administrative nightmare of governing millions of people, building their railroads, and policing their borders, when it could simply own their debt and control their trade routes? The Europeans were playing checkers, moving pieces across a physical board, capturing squares of territory that cost more to maintain than they generated in profit. The Americans were playing three-dimensional chess, realizing that in the modern era, you didn't need to own the land to own the outcome. This was the dawn of the open door, a strategy that weaponized the concept of liberty to serve the demands of capital. By championing the end of colonial rule, the United States wasn't liberating Africa. It was evicting its European competitors. Every time an American diplomat spoke about self-determination in the halls of the United Nations, they were effectively prying open a closed market. If Britain owned Kenya, American Ford dealers and Standard Oil drillers were locked out. But if Kenya was free, then the British monopoly was broken, and the American corporation, backed by the sheer industrial weight of the U.S. economy, could walk right in. They swapped the Union Jack for the dollar sign, replacing the clumsy, visible chains of colonial administration with the invisible, unbreakable bonds of economic dependence. It is crucial to understand the sheer brilliance of this maneuver. While France was bleeding its treasury dry fighting insurgency wars in Algeria, and while Britain was humiliating itself trying to hold onto the Suez, The United States stood back, clean-handed and solvent. Washington understood a fundamental law of power that the old world had forgotten: assets are liabilities. A colony is a heavy asset. It requires garrisons, bureaucrats, and infrastructure. It is a drain on national focus. The American model was asset-light. They didn't want the colony. They wanted the concession. They didn't want the responsibility of the population. They wanted the output of the mines. By rejecting the territorial scramble, America avoided the inevitable backlash of nationalism that would tear the European empires apart. When the African independence movements rose up, they didn't burn American flags. They burned British and French ones, all while looking to Washington for aid, loans, and recognition. This strategic patience paid off in the vacuum of the Cold War. As the Soviet Union rushed in to fill the void left by the retreating Europeans, sending weapons and advisors to prop up Marxist regimes, they too fell into the trap of territorial thinking. Moscow spent billions trying to turn Angola and Ethiopia into satellite states, burdening their own crumbling economy with the weight of distant conflicts. The United States, conversely, often played the spoiler, funding opposition groups or backing strongmen, but rarely committing the full weight of the state to nation building. They understood that chaos was cheaper than occupation. If a region was unstable, the resources could still be extracted, often more cheaply, without the pretense of building a civilized society. If this analysis of how power actually operates, stripping away the moral narratives to see the strategic mechanics underneath, is valuable to you, consider subscribing to keep these investigations going. It helps us continue to decode the history they don't teach in school. The ultimate validation of the American rejection of the scramble came not in the 19th century, but in the late 20th. As the European powers retreated, bruised and bankrupt, the global financial architecture that the United States had built, the World Bank, the IMF, the dominance of the petrodollar, ensured that the wealth of Africa flowed effortlessly toward the West without a single American soldier needing to patrol the Congo. The Europeans had scrambled for sovereignty, but the Americans had secured the flow. They had realized that sovereignty was a trap. If you own the sovereignty, you own the problems. If you control the currency and the supply chain, you own the benefits. This is why, when we look at the geopolitical map today, we see the echoes of that decision. The United States maintains a network of military bases, yes, but these are points of projection, not centers of administration. They are the enforcers of the open sea and the open market, ensuring that the commodities required for American supremacy, cobalt, uranium, oil, remain accessible. The rejection of the scramble was, in fact, the perfection of imperialism. It stripped the empire of its overhead. It was the geopolitical equivalent of moving from manufacturing to software. The margins were higher, the scalability was infinite, and the physical footprint was negligible. In the end, the scramble for Africa was a fever dream of a dying era, a desperate grab by nations that measured power in square miles rather than in market share. America rejected it not out of benevolence, but out of foresight. They saw the iceberg that the Titanic of Europe was steaming toward, the rising tide of nationalism, the demographic explosions, the unsustainable costs of occupation, and they chose not to board the ship. Instead, they built the lifeboat, charged admission, and waited for the inevitable shipwreck to collect the salvage rights. So, when you study the lines on the African map, drawn by European hands in Berlin conference rooms, remember that those lines represent a failure of imagination. They represent a rigid, archaic view of how the world works. The real power, the power that defined the American century, isn't found within those borders. It is found in the shipping lanes that connect them, the satellite networks that monitor them, and the banking servers that process their wealth. America didn't need to scramble for Africa because it had already decided to scramble for the world. The Europeans wanted a piece of the pie. The Americans built the bakery, set the prices, and owned the mortgage on the building. That is the difference between a contender and a hegemon. That is the difference between seizing the past and purchasing the future. The scramble was a tragedy for Africa and a trap for Europe, but for the United States, its rejection was the single smartest investment in the history of modern power.